Yeah, I mean, this writing thing exists for everybody and available for everybody. Even if it's just for people who want to engage in a deeper conversation with themselves. How do we know what we think if we don't write it down? I mean, we can sing it, we can vocalize it, sure, but kind of writing is really a wonderful way of reflecting on that interior self, that imaginative self. And most people, I think, they think that the imagination lives up in the head, my brilliant ideas that I think of in my head. But really, the true depth of imagination lives in our bodies, in the viscera of our heart and our minds, our bones, our muscles. And the way to get at that is through contemplative practices.
Namaste. You're listening to the Savannah Podcast. Join us on an exploration of Eastern spirituality, yoga philosophy, and conscious living for the new age. This podcast is a production of SavannahSpirit.com, the best place to shop for unique clothing, spiritual handcrafted jewelry, healing gemstones, and fair trade gifts from the Far East. Now, here's your host, Brett Larkin.
Hello, Savannah family. Welcome back to the show. Today we are talking about writing as a path to awakening. We're talking to author and poet laureate Albert Flynn DeSilver, and he's going to share with us how writing and meditation can be a powerful pair. In today's episode, we're going to learn about the spiritual nature of language. Albert talks to us about how we can write ourselves into radiant beings and why he doesn't believe in writer's block. Whether you're interested in journaling as part of your introspective practice or interested in publishing your work, maybe pursuing a book, this episode is full of inspirational tips. Before we dive into today's episode, I just want to take a moment to encourage you to support the show, to give back. And the easiest way to do that is to make a purchase at SavannahSpirit.com. Today, I'm featuring their healing crystals. They have beautiful gemstones that you can wear as jewelry or simply carry around. Citrine, aquamarine, moonstone, rose quartz, so many beautiful options. And when you treat yourself to something or get a gift for someone, use the code podcast30. That's going to give you 30% off your order. And again, it's supporting the show as well. Now, introducing our guest, Albert Flynn DeSilver is an American poet, memoirist, novelist, speaker, and meditation teacher at the Spirit Rock Meditation Center in Woodacre, California. He teaches nationally at the Omega Institute, Esalen, and so many others. He's an internationally published poet and served as Marin County, California's very first Poet Laureate from 2008 to 2010. He shared the stage with international best-selling authors such as Cheryl Strayed, Elizabeth Gilbert, and many others. And his new book, Writing as a Path to Awakening, A Year to Becoming an Excellent Writer and Living an Awakened Life based on his popular writing workshops by the same name, is now available. Albert, thank you so much for being here and for coming on the show.
It's a delight, Brett. Thanks for having me.
So can you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background?
Generally speaking, I'm a poet and a writer, and I've actually been writing mostly novels lately, written nonfiction, wrote a memoir about transcending loss and addiction and becoming a writer and being sort of saved by poetry and art. What else can I say around that?
Well, it sounds like writing is a big passion of yours and that it's also fueled your spiritual development and your exploration of that path.
Sure. And there's lots of stories in the book about those origins. I mean, I was actually trained as a photographer.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I went to undergrad at the University of Colorado and studied photography and got a BFA, Bachelor's of Fine Arts, in photography. And then I graduated, didn't know what to do with myself, painted houses for a while, then felt safer in school. So I applied to more art school, never enough art school. And I'd taken some, what I thought, finally, some interesting photographs when I was traveling in East Africa. And I submitted those with some text. And it was the first time I'd ever really included writing and text with the photographs. And I sent those off to the San Francisco Art Institute, which seemed like the only city that I could possibly tolerate living in. And that was my criteria, like a cool city that I could live in that had a decent photography program. But so I did. I sent off a portfolio, and they loved the photographs and invited me to the MFA program. So I came to San Francisco in the early 90s to study photography with Linda Connor and Jack Fulton and a whole bunch of other amazing artists and photographers.
So even the MFA was in photography?
Well, it was until I actually failed my year-end review.
Oh my goodness!
Like, how do you fail at art, right? But somehow I managed to do it. What happened was I was experimenting a lot, and I was starting to get into writing a little bit. And they wanted a more comprehensive portfolio of photographs pinned up on the wall. And I threw up like a Xeroxed half poem and a piece of canvas with a whole bunch of house paint all over it and some weird performance sculptures I'd done. And it was all so discombobulated and ungrounded that they told me I had to resubmit for my year-end review. And so what I did was I actually transferred out of the photography department to the new genres department, where I knew they would give me a little bit less of a hassle. And so I ended up doing some random performance piece, and eventually I passed. So I technically graduated with a degree in new genres.
And it's interesting you use that word ungrounded when you just talked about your work and your art. Did you have a meditation practice, yoga practice, spiritual practice during this time?
Definitely not. No, I was in my late 20s, and I had arrived to San Francisco. I think I had done some shows in Denver and Boulder, and I thought I was kind of an okay photographer. And I got to San Francisco, and it was just like, this was the big leagues, and I was just lost and flailing, and still hadn't dealt with just all this trauma from my childhood. And so, but right around this time, before I graduated, Bill Berkson, who was a teacher at the Art Institute, everyone had to go through his class. He was the art historian and a really great art writer for Art in America. And he was also a poet. And one night he tells me that there's this poetry reading down at the Cal Theater and I should come check it out. And I was like, Bill, I'm not really into poetry, but I actually don't have anything going on tonight. So what the heck, I'll come check it out. So I go down to the Cal Theater, and lo and behold, it's the launch reading for the Norton Anthology of Postmodern American Poetry. And it's this like huge, all star-studded cast of amazing poets. Diane de Prima and Lynn Hegenian and Alice Notley is in from Paris. And it was this incredible display of writing and language that I had never experienced before. I had never thought of poetry in this way. And I was just floored. And that was kind of the shift for me in terms of creativity, of moving from photography and visual art into writing. And then it wasn't until a couple of years later that a friend of mine kind of turned me on to this place, Spirit Rock. And Jack Cornfield, who taught a Monday night class out in north of San Francisco. And so she brought me to this, and I went, and I was very enamored with the whole poetry thing. And so I go to this class, and Jack Cornfield is reading poetry. Like, he devoted almost the entire, we did our silent meditation thing, but then in his Dharma talk, it was all about poetry and the spiritual nature of language that has the potential to bring you back to the present moment and to ground you in ultimate reality and all this stuff. And that too blew my mind. And so that's when I kind of got into seeing these as two paths.
So you just said the spiritual nature of language. Can you elaborate on that? Because I think for so many of us, our idea of spirituality is maybe like getting out of our head and into our body, for example. Like a lot of people who listen to this podcast and do yoga, for example. So it's really interesting to me that you're saying the spiritual nature of language, because I think of language as kind of being more in the head. So I'm curious to have you talk more about this.
Well, yeah. So I'm all about writing from the body and not so much from the head. After that was the first time I went to Spirit Rock. That was back in, I want to say 1996 or so. And so I've been meditating and trying to re-inhabit my body for the past 24 years or whatever it's been, 20 something years, 22 years. And because I was so disconnected as a kid, I was so terrified to be present and awake in my body just because of the abuse and because of neglect and just the addiction and all this trauma I experienced as a kid. And so, mindfulness meditation and particularly insight meditation is all about the breath. It's all about being with the breath. And it inherently asks you to return to presence rooted and centered in the body. And so that's where I came of age doing these practices. And so my writing also kind of started to inhabit that, is seductive as like the heady and intellectual aspects of writing are. I think the most interesting writing comes from the body. It comes from that emotional, dynamic, spiritual place that lives in the fibers of our bodies, and what Natalie Goldberg calls it writing down the bones, right? It's sort of writing directly from that visceral experience.
And this is very intriguing to me. So how do we write from the body? I mean, how do we know when we write from the body as opposed to writing from our head? Does it feel different?
I think so. Yeah, it starts with courage. First of all, the courage to be present and to be awake to the body, being, whether that's being willing to confront the positive sensations in the body, but also the difficult sensations, the challenging, scary sensations, the terrifying sensations. I think most people would prefer to live in their heads. I think a lot of people do live in their heads. There's a natural inclination to go into the imagination and into the mind. It's safer up there. We can sort of disconnect. But I think it's a practice, and that's why they do refer to it over and over again as a practice, because it's not innate, particularly in our culture. We're a culture of escape. We're a culture of external visualizing outward. And meditation, mindfulness, yoga, tai chi, these are inward practices that take a certain degree of courage and repeated attention.
So I definitely agree that, yoga, tai chi, some of these things you're talking about are very much a introspective practice that's very body connected. But I'm curious because I'm wondering if listeners are thinking this too. It's like, how is writing like that as well? Because I know your book is all about writing as a path to awakening. And what does that mean in terms of what we're writing? And I know you have dozens of workshops around this, but give us a taste. Like, what does it mean if someone listening to this is like, what does it mean to write from my body? Or why would I even want to incorporate writing into my life if I have no desire to be a poet or novelist? Is there still value in pursuing writing in the form of journaling, perhaps, or, just writing for yourself?
Yeah, I mean, this writing thing exists for everybody and available for everybody. Even if it's just for people who want to engage in a deeper conversation with themselves. How do we know what we think if we don't write it down? I mean, we can sing it, we can vocalize it, sure, but kind of writing is really a wonderful way of reflecting on that interior self, that imaginative self. And most people, I think, they think that the imagination lives up in the head, my brilliant ideas that I think of in my head. But really, the true depth of imagination lives in our bodies, in the viscera of our heart and our minds, our bones, our muscles. And the way to get at that is through contemplative practices, through meditation practice, through yoga movement, contemplative movement. And the book is set up into 12 different chapters, and they're themed on the 12 months of the year. And there's a meditation exercise and a writing exercise at the end of each chapter. And the meditation always comes first, because that's where we can let go of thinking mind, of controlling mind. And the practices are based on the tradition of free writing, as popularized by people like Natalie Goldberg. But, they really go back years and years from the beginning of time of people just wanting to write directly from their direct experience rather than their controlled or learned experience.
So Albert, can you tell us what free writing means? Just because I'm not familiar with that term and I want to make sure listeners understand what it means. It just means writing with no agenda or writing from your own direct experience?
Well, that's part of it. Yeah, so it's timed writing. It's stream of consciousness writing.
Oh, is it kind of like Julia Cameron's morning pages?
A little bit, but the way to really set up is everything, and intention is everything. And so usually what we do is we set a time period. That could be 5 minutes, it could be 10 minutes, it could be 15 minutes. We set a timer. We have maybe a simple prompt to get us going. But other than that, there's no worrying, there's no stopping. So once the pen hits the page, once that clock is set and you hit go, you just go from margin to margin along the page.
Interesting. So I can't lift up my pen. Not allowed.
Not allowed. Now,
Cool.
You don't pause to like correct or self-correct or cross out or worry about grammar or spelling or punctuation or any of that stuff. You're just writing urgently, you're writing quickly, you're writing what's ever there as it comes through the body, the heart, the mind, and you just burp it out on the page.
And you said like burp it out, because what I'm thinking when I've done this and I've done morning pages and I love journaling, I find what I end up writing about initially is a lot of like the vritti, the mind chatter that's just in my head. It's almost like I feel like I'm just, getting kind of garbage dumping onto the page almost, just random thoughts. And I'd love for you to talk more to this, because to me, that seems like it's like an emptying out of the stuff in my head, not so much a writing from my body, but maybe that's like a prerequisite of something that needs to happen first before you can connect deeper. What are your thoughts on this?
Well said. I like it. Yeah, so it's part of that. It is like getting some of that busyness out of your head. That could be part of it. But I think when you truly write urgently and quickly from a prompt, a surprising prompt, it can get you, it can sort of guide you into an unexpected, surprising place. And, the other thing that I do in my workshops is that we do a lot of movement stuff. We do walking meditations. We do these various body scan exercises, standing meditations. We do various movement exercises that channel our intention and our attention into the body. And then we come out of that and go directly to the page before we even have time to overly think and overly control or overly doubt what we're writing. And we just let things be as they are.
That's cool. I like that idea of like that you do a physical practice and then you get yourself onto writing on a page really quickly. So there's not that in between time to get distracted, or it's like you stay with the physical sensation and then write immediately after.
Right. And this is a little bit different than kind of processing information or ideas you have about your experience in life, whether that's reflecting on a certain relationship challenge or a job challenge or whatever it is, whatever we find ourselves journaling into. A lot of times you're just thinking about that particular topic, right? You're not necessarily kind of sparking off on a prompt and allowing a sense of urgency and bodily awareness to emerge from that prompt. So it's a little bit different.
So what does do you have a morning practice of writing or journaling? I'm imagining so. And I know you've written so many things. I mean, you're a poet, you've written a memoir, you've written a book on writing, and then, fiction and nonfiction as well. What does your personal ritual or routine around all of this look like? I mean, I know you mentioned in the book, you talk about meditating before you come to write. I love that. And I know the reverse has also worked really well for me, especially since the writing for me is often therapeutic to get rid of that mind chatter like we talked about, right? So sometimes I find it easier to meditate once I kind of dump a lot of the thoughts that have been running around in my head on the page first. I'm curious what your personal ritual is.
Well, it varies, but generally when I'm working on a project, and I tend to work in projects, so I'll have a particular book contract, like for this nonfiction project, or I give myself various assignments, as it were, write this novel, or I had years ago, about 3 or 4 years ago, I was traveling in northern England and went to Hadrian's Wall for the first time, which was built in the 2nd century by the Roman Emperor Hadrian. It was the northernmost part of the Roman Empire. And it was just such an amazing, incredible experience that this wall was still there. And then I just started doing research. I became so curious about the history of this wall, and et cetera, et cetera. And I just sort of knew that there was a poetry book there. There was a poetry idea there but I didn't do anything. I didn't really write into it. I took a few notes, but I just let it be for 3 or 4 years. And then this summer, I just started jumping into it. And I just started writing based on some research I had done. And so that looked like sitting on my couch every morning and writing freehand in my notebook and just kind of riffing off of some different prompts I had given myself around this idea. I had a framework. I had some historical books to reflect on, etc. And so that was a daily practice of writing. And then I would meditate in the evening. Sometimes when there is when I'm in a project and I'm writing every day, I won't meditate first. Sometimes I'll wake up and the words and the energy for that project and that idea are so present that I want to get that out. I want to get it out on the page, and then I'll save meditation for the evening. I think the reverse is extremely helpful when we're a little drowsy or we're a little stuck, and to meditate first. And to, I don't have a challenge with any of this 90% of the time. The writing, I don't believe in writer's block. I don't experience it myself. I believe it's a real thing for people, but there's an easy antidote, which is silence. And just revisiting that stream of creative energy that's all around us at all times. But it can seem obscured when we get too caught in our heads.
So if someone feels blocked, whether with writing or maybe a different creative project, you're saying coming into silence is really the antidote. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Coming into silence and coming into conscious movement. I think these are the two things that have really helped me. Moving my body and also being still. So exercising things out, staying engaged in the body, stretching, moving, walking, riding your bike, whatever. And not simultaneously, but also alternating with periods of stillness, with absolute silence, where you're just letting go of the thoughts. Because most of what blocks us is thinking that it's supposed to be a certain way. Right? We have certain expectations about, I went to school, I know how to write, and I'm well-read, and I practice, I should be able to write. When I sit down, I should be able to write something great, and it should look like this. But that's not the way it is. We have to allow ourselves to write what's actually there in our experience at this moment. It might be that we're still grieving a loss, or that we're not feeling that great, or that we're kind of fatigued or whatever. But when you can allow yourself to write into the truth of your direct experience in that moment, that's when things get really interesting. That's when the reality and the presence of your experience shows up, and it becomes more authentic. It becomes more real. But you might not recognize it because you're so used to wanting to kind of control it, and you have certain expectations or visions for it rather than letting go.
Yeah, I can relate to what you're saying here. I think so often anyone who's creative, you want to finish whatever project you're working on and you're passionate about, but life is happening at the same time, right? So you may wake up and, not feel like working on it. And I think what we're ultimately a little bit maybe going to shift into talking to here is this interplay between structure and freedom, right? You need to force yourself to finish projects, otherwise they'd all never get done. At the same time, if you deep down are feeling grief or feeling sadness, or there's something else going on in the present moment, maybe you need to honor and write about that or do creative work around that instead. And how do you balance those two? Indulging in what feels like you need to do right now while still knowing that you have a commitment to yourself, your art, or maybe to a book publisher of something that needs to get finished.
Yeah, it's a dance, and I think ultimately there's a level of intuition around it that just gets more clear with time and with practice. But I've always found in my experience when I get out of my own way, things become clear. So it's this process of just simply letting go. That's why I love meditation practice so much. Just for sitting 20 to 40 minutes a day with nothing, with no agenda, no control, no manipulation, no need for change, no need for anything to be other than it is. Even if that's painful in the moment, even if it's sad in the moment, even if it's frustrating in the moment, just what's it like to be with frustration? What's it like to be with the unknown? And I think we all need to kind of discover those answers on our own. What I can say is that practice is not easy, but incredibly healing and transformational.
Albert, can you give me and the listeners an example, a practical example of this sort of silence and conscious movement that you talked about earlier? Because I'm just trying to get a clear visual of what that looks like. I mean, is it like doing yoga and then sitting to reflect, or is it like taking a bike ride and then writing after the bike ride? What does that look like for you and your students?
Well, so I can give you, sort of a little breakdown of what happens in a retreat workshop setting, and then for me, like sort of in my own practice. And it's really alternating through, I forget who it was. It might have been Deepak Chopra, who said something about how meditation, the beautiful thing about meditation is that it imbues every other aspect of our lives, our interactions and relationships, our creative work, how we show up for business and daily life and doing ordinary chores and so forth. It kind of imbues and gives us a sensibility and a way to approach those other aspects of our lives. So I do think that meditation practice and entering into silence is a really great baseline for just simply sitting and breathing, sitting, following your breath with no agenda, with no preconceived notions, and just being with the body and checking in to see what it feels like to be embodied in this moment with all that's arising and passing away within you, the sensations, the thoughts, the ideas, the beliefs, and reconnecting to that bigger picture, that larger ground of being that is our true nature. We get so over-identified with our individual self that we lose track of reality. And I think meditation is stepping back into reality and giving us a bigger perspective. And so that's one practice. And then the other practice is maybe being actively engaged in movement, exercise, whatever that looks like to you, whether that's hot yoga or jogging or mountain biking or conscious stretching or Pilates or whatever. Most of those you're engaging the mind in a particular way, but you're also really being in your body and keeping things moving and keeping the head clear, the cells shifting around. And that keeps us sane and keeps us healthy, and I think ultimately aids in our creativity.
Now, I know you've mentioned having a really challenging childhood, and it sounded like you had a lot of emotional processing that had to happen. Did writing play a key role in your healing?
Absolutely.
And what did that look like? I mean, was it journaling? Because I think all of us have been through hard times, grief, and if something as simple as a paper and a pen can help us, like, what does that look like?
Yeah, I think it's just allowing yourself to be real on the page. There's something very liberating about writing into a notebook, into a blank space, knowing that nobody's ever going to have to read this, that this is between you and God or goddess or whatever, the great spirit, whatever you want to call it. And it's just your place to vent, to express, to explore, to be curious about what you think and what you feel, to give you a sense of like, wow, what's going on here? What is this consciousness that is me? And how can I navigate my way through some of these tough situations with a little more clarity, a little more insight? And I think writing can give us that. For me, it was a total savior, just being able to, I felt completely stuck as a kid, just kind of like trapped with no way to express myself. I didn't have any healthy way of expressing myself. So I lashed out, and I could only express myself when I was altered in some way, i.e. drunk or stoned. But that wasn't particularly creative. So when I found art, and I found like I could sort of shout on the page, or I could scream through a photograph, or, I could kind of bleed in a way using language and using art to kind of bleed out some of my interior difficulties. That was very liberating for me and very healing for me, and I think kept me sane.
And for people listening who are like, well, I want to do that, what does that look like? Were you doing just the free writing? Did you have a structure?
Grab a notebook. Join me down at 1440 in June.
Yes, come to a workshop, grab a notebook for sure. But I mean, I know so many people are intimidated to start writing. It's like they just feel like whatever's in their head isn't important enough to put on the page, and it can be overwhelming.
That's one of the great myths that I like to dismantle in this book, and that's really why I wrote this book, because writing language is accessible for all of us. I mean, I think culture at large is accessible for all of us. Like you say, we become intimidated because we see other people out there and, oh, well, they're published. And, at some point in my own career as a human being, I started thinking to myself, like, well, why do these people get to be the purveyors of culture or the creators of culture? Like, why can't I participate? I finally realized, I can participate. I just have to start. I just have to give myself permission and allow that to happen. And that, I think, that comes through a lot of different practices, and also we come upon writers and teachers who remind us to give ourselves permission, or they give us permission. Not that, and I use that word lightly. I mean, permission. You don't need anybody's permission. But what I mean by that is that there's this sense of, oh my God, here's this person writing from their heart, being authentic on the page. And that inspires me to feel like I can do that also. And maybe I don't want to show it to anybody, and maybe I'm just going to keep it between me and me for now. But maybe there'll be a day when I feel like I can show it to somebody, or maybe I'll feel like I want to engage in a larger conversation and begin to build an audience, and so forth and so on. So I think we have to be gentle with ourselves and check in periodically to see what we really want to do with this writing thing and how we want it to live in our lives.
So a good place for people to start, I think, based on what you've talked about, sounds like maybe the free writing exercise, like just setting a timer for 5 minutes and maybe doing that as part of their morning practice, or integrating it at the beginning or end of their meditation practice or movement practice, something like that.
Sure. I mean, I just straight up good old-fashioned journaling is also great, and reading, becoming a more engaged and more careful reader, and allowing those words not to just, separate you from the author, but allowing those words to really kind of weave through your body, weave through your consciousness, and remind you that you're part of this conversation. When somebody writes a book, they're communicating with you. Those words are coming into you and they're flowing within you. And then eventually, as you write, they come back out as filtered through your experience. And so allow the reading to be part of the writing process. Allow the reading to inspire you to write what's in your heart and your experience.
Savannah listeners, let me know what you thought of this week's episode. Remember, the number one way you can support the show is really simply by just leaving a rating or review on iTunes, even if iTunes isn't how you normally listen to the show. And if you're not sure how to leave a review, just go to savannahspirit.com/review, and we have step-by-step instructions for you. I really hope you feel inspired to do some writing, and maybe even to write a poem this week or weekend. I'm sending you so much love. From my heart to yours, namaste.
You've been listening to the Savannah Podcast. To find out more about Savannah, go to savannahspirit.com or follow Savannah on Facebook at facebook.com/Savannah Spirit. For daily inspiration, check out our blog at savannaeast.com. Be sure to join us next week for a new episode, and thank you for listening to the Savannah Podcast.